The cells stank of sweat, fear, and despair. Cold, metallic walls loomed overhead, slick with moisture from the planet's harsh atmosphere. The only sound that broke the silence was the hum of alien machinery, always present, always watching. It was hard to tell what time it was, if time even mattered here anymore. There was no day, no night, just endless gray. They had been captured weeks ago. Or had it been months? No one kept track anymore. To the aliens, the humans were just a means to an end, workers, slaves, nothing more. The Overlords saw them as weak, a species barely worth noticing, let alone respecting. They tossed them in cages like animals, shackling their wrists and ankles with heavy, unbreakable metal. The chains clanged loudly every time someone moved, a constant reminder of their captivity. In the far corner of the room, he sat, silent and still. The others didn't know his name, and neither did the aliens. To them, he was just another prisoner, another broken soul waiting to give up. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. The Overlords had taken everything from him, his home, his people, his freedom. He'd watched them raze cities to the ground, obliterating any trace of resistance. Their weapons were beyond anything humans had ever imagined. They'd burned the earth and its defenders in mere moments, showing no mercy. Those that survived the invasion were either killed or captured, and he was one of the unlucky ones. The aliens who guarded them were tall and grotesque, with elongated limbs and sharp, glassy eyes. They had the strength of machines and the cruelty of predators. They didn't speak much to the humans, but when they did, it was always with sneers, laughter, and mocking tones. Their words were full of disdain, as though humans weren't even worth the effort of proper communication. One of them, a particularly smug creature, often lingered near the cells just to taunt the prisoners. It would click and hiss in its language, but the translator embedded in his arm made sure he understood every word. Pathetic. Weak. How did your species ever think it could survive against us? You're nothing but vermin, crawling in the dirt, clinging to life when you should have surrendered long ago. He didn't react. Not outwardly, anyway. His face remained stony, his eyes unblinking. Inside, though, the rage boiled. They didn't know him. They didn't know humanity. Not really. The alien slithered closer, pressing its face against the bars of his cell. Look at you sitting there, hoping for a miracle. There's no escape for you. No rescue. No one's coming for you. You're ours now, until we decide to end it. Still, he stayed silent. The alien laughed, the sound high-pitched and grating. You humans, always so stubborn, so proud. It's amusing, really. How long before you beg? Before you cry out for mercy like the rest of them? There was no answer. He wasn't going to give the creature the satisfaction. The alien grew tired of its game, eventually moving on to mock another prisoner, leaving him alone with his thoughts once again. The others in the cell occasionally glanced his way, but no one dared speak. Fear had robbed them of their voices. But fear hadn't touched him. Not yet. Not after everything he'd seen. He stared at his shackled wrists, flexing his fingers beneath the weight of the metal. The chains were too strong to break, and even if he could snap them, where would he go? The entire facility was locked down tighter than a fortress. Escape wasn't possible, not now, at least. But that didn't stop him from thinking about it. From planning. They thought they had broken him. That's what they believed about all humans. The aliens were too arrogant to see the truth. The more they pushed, the more they mocked, the stronger his resolve became. He wasn't broken. He was waiting. Biding his time. Watching them, learning their routines, their patterns. The alien guards moved the same way every day. Their patrols were predictable, their shifts too regular. There were flaws, small ones, in their impenetrable control. The locks, the technology, it all had weaknesses. It was just a matter of finding the right moment to act. The other prisoners had given up. He could see it in their eyes. The hopelessness. They shuffled along, doing what the aliens demanded, because fighting back seemed pointless. They had been beaten, both physically and mentally. But he wasn't like them. He couldn't let go. He wouldn't. The image of Earth burned bright in his mind, his home, his family, everything they had taken from him. He would get it back. Somehow. The clanking of chains echoed through the room as the prisoners were led out for another round of forced labor. He rose to his feet, the weight of his shackles heavier than ever, but he moved without hesitation. The guards barked orders, their hissing voices sharp and cold. As they marched through the long corridors of the alien facility, he kept his eyes forward, but his mind worked constantly. The aliens believed humans to be inferior because they lacked the technology, the strength, the numbers. But humans had something else, something the aliens couldn't understand. They had a drive, a resilience that refused to be snuffed out, no matter how hard they tried. He felt the weight of the guard's gaze on him again, the same alien from before. It stalked alongside the group, its posture oozing superiority. Every now and then, it would glance at him, waiting for a sign of weakness, waiting for the human to falter. But he didn't. One day, they would see. The aliens would learn the truth, that humanity was not to be underestimated. They had mocked him, ridiculed him, laughed at the notion that he could ever be a threat. But soon, they'd realize their mistake. And when that day came, he'd be ready. Each day felt the same, a loop of suffering that seemed endless. The alien overlords forced the prisoners into grueling work, laboring in the cold, dark mines beneath the facility. The humans were weak, malnourished, and exhausted, but the aliens didn't care. To them, humans were expendable. If one collapsed, another would take their place. And if they all died? The overlords had no shortage of replacements. He dug into the ground with dull tools, hands blistered and cracked from the endless toil. The chains on his wrists clinked with every movement, a constant reminder of the prison they all shared. The others worked in silence around him, their eyes downcast, their bodies hunched from exhaustion. They had been beaten into submission, their spirits crushed. But he refused to break. The guards patrolled the tunnels, barking orders in their harsh, guttural language. The translator still worked, but he didn't need it to understand. The cruelty was evident in their tone, the way they sneered as they watched humans struggle under the weight of their labor. They enjoyed it. The suffering gave them pleasure, their laughter echoing through the dark, damp corridors. He never looked at them. He focused on his work, not because he cared about what they wanted, but because it gave him time to think. The labor was harsh, but it gave him a rhythm to settle into, a pattern that allowed his mind to stay sharp. He wasn't like the others who had let despair take root. No, he still had a plan, even if it was only in its early stages. Each day, he learned something new. The aliens might be stronger, faster, and more advanced, but they weren't perfect. Their arrogance blinded them to their own weaknesses. He'd noticed how they rarely paid full attention during the shifts, growing complacent in their control over the prisoners. The technology they used, though advanced, had vulnerabilities. He just needed to understand how to exploit them. Sometimes, when the guards weren't looking, he would test the limits of the chains, pulling slightly harder or moving a bit quicker than allowed. It was never enough to draw attention, but it was enough to feel where the restraints were weakest. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew that eventually, he'd find a way. At night, when they were locked back in their cells, the other prisoners would lie on the cold floor, barely moving, barely speaking. But his mind was always turning. He had started to map out the facility in his head, marking the locations of the guards, the shifts they took, and the possible exits. Escape seemed impossible, but impossible was a word he had stopped believing in. He couldn't help but think of the world he had left behind, the one the aliens had destroyed. Memories of his family flashed through his mind, his wife, his children. He had lost them in the chaos of the invasion, and their faces haunted him at night. That was what kept him going, what made the pain and suffering bearable. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for them, for the memory of what was taken from him. The aliens taunted them at every opportunity. They would walk by the cells at night, shouting insults, reminding the prisoners of their helplessness. The overlords loved to remind them that Earth was gone, that humanity's resistance had been futile. They talked about how quickly their forces had wiped out any trace of human defiance, leaving only scattered survivors to be rounded up like animals. "You're lucky," one of the guards sneered one night as they passed by. "Lucky to be alive. But not for long. None of you will last here. You'll die in chains, just like the rest." The words had their intended effect. Many of the prisoners shuddered, curling further into themselves. But not him. He met the alien's gaze without flinching, without fear. That small act of defiance earned him a brutal backhand from the guard, sending him sprawling against the wall of the cell. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, but he didn't react. The guard laughed, moving on to the next cell, content in its small victory. But it wasn't a victory. It was a mistake. The more they tried to crush him, the stronger his resolve became. He learned something new every time they lashed out. They were strong, yes, but their strength made them careless. They believed no one could fight back, and that belief would be their downfall. He began to study the guards closely. Their patterns, their routines, the technology they used. The prison was filled with security systems, force fields, motion sensors, surveillance drones, but it all had flaws. He just needed to figure out when and where those flaws could be exploited. It was a slow process, but he wasn't in a hurry. Patience was a weapon in itself. The other prisoners began to notice. They saw the way he moved, the way he observed everything around him, and they started to watch him more closely. Some of them, the ones who hadn't completely lost hope, seemed to take comfort in his quiet determination. They didn't speak much, but he could feel their eyes on him. They were waiting for something, anything, to change. He knew he couldn't do it alone. If he ever had a chance at escaping, he would need their help. But they weren't ready yet. They were too afraid, too broken. He would have to show them that there was still a chance, that the fight wasn't over. Each day brought more pain, more suffering, but it also brought more opportunities. The cracks in the alien's control were small, but they were there. He saw them in the way the guards grew complacent, in the way the machinery occasionally faltered. He just needed to keep watching, keep learning. The others didn't understand. Not yet. But they would. Soon enough, they would see that there was a way out. And when that moment came, he would be ready. The chains around his wrists felt heavier with each passing day, but they wouldn't hold him forever. He was waiting for the right moment, the right weakness to expose. And when that moment came, he wouldn't hesitate. The aliens believed they had broken him, that they had broken all of them. But they were wrong. Humanity wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The days had stretched into a blur of endless toil and punishment. The cold bite of the shackles, the jeers of the guards, and the weight of his chains had all become part of the routine. But routine couldn't erase what was building inside him. Anger simmered under the surface, kept in check only by his iron will. He had spent every waking moment watching, planning, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The guards, so sure of their dominance, barely paid attention anymore. That was their first mistake. Then it happened. One day, while the prisoners were working in the mines, something shifted. One of the weaker men stumbled and fell, too exhausted to continue. A guard rushed over, his harsh voice echoing through the tunnels. The alien struck the man, not once, but again and again. The prisoner barely made a sound, too weak to even cry out. It was the kind of scene that had played out countless times before, but this time, something snapped. The guard turned his attention away from the prisoner, distracted for just a second. It was enough. Without thinking, his body reacted. He sprang forward, his chains rattling as he moved faster than anyone could have expected. He slammed into the guard, catching the alien completely off guard. The impact was fierce, sending both of them crashing to the ground. The guard let out a strangled cry, more from shock than pain. In an instant, the entire mind froze. No one had dared to attack a guard before. No one had even thought it possible. The guard scrambled to get back on his feet, but it was too late. He was on him again, his fists landing blow after blow. The guards had underestimated the humans for too long. They believed the chains and the beatings had stripped them of their strength, but they were wrong. The fire inside him had never died. And now, it burned hotter than ever. The other guards rushed in, their weapons drawn, shouting commands in their alien tongue. But the moment had already passed. The prisoners had seen what happened. They saw that a guard could be taken down, that the chains didn't make them helpless. Slowly, the others began to move, hesitation turning into action. One by one, they joined the fight, throwing themselves at the guards, driven by a desperation they hadn't felt in years. Chaos erupted. The aliens, who had always assumed they were in complete control, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. The humans, though weak and outnumbered, fought like cornered animals. They had nothing left to lose, and that made them dangerous. He didn't stop. The first guard was down, blood dripping from the gashes in its pale skin. Another guard charged him, swinging a heavy baton, but he ducked under the blow, driving his shoulder into the alien's stomach. The guard stumbled back, its weapon clattering to the ground. He grabbed it, the cold metal feeling right in his hands. The alien tried to recover, but it was too slow. The baton cracked against its skull with a sickening thud. More guards flooded the tunnels, their shouts filling the air. But the prisoners had momentum now. For the first time since their capture, they felt something other than fear. They felt the possibility of freedom, of fighting back. Even if they didn't win today, even if this rebellion was crushed, they had shown the aliens one thing: humanity wasn't broken. His body ached, his muscles burning with every swing, every strike. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The guards were tough, but they weren't invincible. The prisoners had numbers on their side, and while they weren't trained soldiers, they fought with a ferocity that the aliens couldn't match. The aliens relied on fear, on their superior technology and strength, but here in the tunnels, none of that mattered. The sound of chains rattling filled the air as more and more prisoners tore free of their shackles, using anything they could find as weapons: rocks, broken tools, even their own chains. The guards tried to maintain control, but their arrogance had blinded them. They never expected the humans to fight back, and now they were paying the price. For every guard that fell, more prisoners found their courage. The rebellion grew, spreading through the mines like wildfire. The aliens, once so sure of their power, began to falter. He could see the fear in their eyes now, the same fear they had used to control the humans for so long. It was a bitter, satisfying irony. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of what would come next. The guards still had reinforcements. If they regrouped, if they managed to call in more soldiers, the rebellion would be crushed. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Still, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to take in what they had accomplished. The tunnels were littered with fallen guards, their weapons scattered across the ground. The prisoners, though battered and bruised, stood tall. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was a spark of hope in their eyes. He knew what came next. They couldn't stop here. This was only the beginning. The facility was vast, and beyond the mines, there were still hundreds of guards, maybe more. But now they had something they hadn't had before: belief. Belief that they could win, that they could break free from the chains that had bound them for so long. He looked around at the faces of his fellow prisoners, saw the determination in their eyes. They were ready. Ready to fight, ready to die if they had to. But they wouldn't go down without a fight. Not now. With a final glance at the fallen guards, he tightened his grip on the stolen weapon. The time for waiting was over. The chains were broken. The fight had begun. And this time, they wouldn't stop until they were free. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back now. The guards were down, scattered throughout the tunnels, and the prisoners had seized the moment. It wasn't much of a victory yet, but it was the spark they needed. The fire of resistance burned brightly in their eyes, fueled by the taste of freedom, however small. But they all knew it was only the beginning. The facility above ground still loomed over them, full of alien soldiers who would soon come for them. He knew they didn't have much time. The guards who had escaped the initial attack would regroup, and reinforcements would flood the tunnels. The momentary chaos had given them a slim window of opportunity, and they needed to act fast. There was no going back to being prisoners. The only way out was forward, and that meant taking the fight directly to the aliens. Gathering the prisoners, he took charge, his voice steady but urgent. They needed weapons, and they needed a plan. The alien weapons weren't complex, but they were powerful, and more importantly, they were now in human hands. He had taken one of the guards' batons, and others had picked up rifles and energy blades. It wasn't enough to storm the entire facility, but it was a start. They moved quickly through the tunnels, staying low, keeping out of sight. The sound of alien voices echoed faintly in the distance, but it was clear they hadn't fully regrouped yet. That was good. It gave them time to reach the upper levels, where the control centers were located. If they could disable the security systems, cut off communication, and disrupt the aliens' chain of command, they had a real shot. As they advanced, he couldn't help but notice the shift in the prisoners. Just hours ago, these people had been hollow, broken, and lifeless. Now they moved with purpose, eyes sharp, hands steady. The fear that had ruled them for so long was gone, replaced by something stronger: hope. He hadn't given any speeches, hadn't needed to. His actions had spoken louder than words. The moment he had taken down that guard, he had shown them what was possible. And now, they believed it too. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the lower security station. Alien guards had regrouped faster than expected, and they were ready, blocking the way with energy shields and rifles raised. The prisoners hesitated, fear flickering back for a moment. But he didn't stop. He surged forward, firing the stolen weapon in his hands. The first guard went down with a single shot, and the others followed his lead, charging at the aliens with everything they had. The battle was fierce, chaotic, but the prisoners fought like they had nothing left to lose. And in a way, they didn't. Each alien that fell gave them another step closer to freedom. Each shot that missed, every swing that connected, it all added to the momentum they were building. The aliens, for all their strength and technology, weren't ready for this. They had never imagined that the prisoners would rebel, and now that it was happening, they didn't know how to stop it. When the last guard at the security station fell, there was a brief silence, a moment where the only sound was the labored breathing of the prisoners. He wiped the sweat and grime from his face, looking around at his fellow humans. They were bloodied and bruised, but they were still standing. That was more than he could have hoped for. They quickly disabled the security systems, shutting down the cameras and motion detectors that covered the facility. With those down, they had a chance to move more freely, but the hardest part was still ahead. They had to get to the central hub, where the alien command was based. That was where they could cut off the entire operation. If they could cripple the command structure, the guards would be disorganized, and chaos would spread. The climb to the surface was tense. Every step felt like it could be their last. Every corner they turned, they expected to meet a wall of alien soldiers. But they kept going. They had to. There was no other option. He led them with a calmness that surprised even himself. It wasn't courage, not really. It was necessity. He couldn't afford to doubt or hesitate, not with so many lives depending on this. When they finally reached the upper levels, the real challenge began. The command center was heavily fortified, as expected. The alien overlords were there, barking orders to the remaining guards. The sight of them reignited the rage that had been burning inside him since the moment they had captured him. These were the beings responsible for all the suffering, for every death, for the destruction of his home. He wouldn't stop until they were defeated. The prisoners gathered behind him, their makeshift weapons ready. He gave a quick signal, and they launched their attack. The aliens weren't ready for the ferocity of the charge. Energy blasts flew through the air, bodies collided, and the sounds of battle filled the room. The overlords fought back with everything they had, but the prisoners had the advantage now. They had surprise, determination, and the will to win. It was brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. He fought with everything he had, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. Every blow he landed felt like justice. Every guard that fell brought them one step closer to victory. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for freedom, for vengeance, for everything they had lost. The battle for the command center wasn't quick, but it was decisive. When the last of the Overlords fell, the prisoners stood victorious. The facility, once a symbol of their oppression, now lay in ruins. The command center was theirs, the alien forces scattered and broken. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and victory. He looked around at the others, their faces tired but triumphant. They had done it. Against all odds, they had taken the first real step toward freedom. But it wasn't over yet. This was just one facility, one battle in a much larger war. The aliens still controlled the planet, still held humanity in their grasp. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The facility was theirs, but the fight wasn't over. The command center lay in ruins, but outside, the world still belonged to the aliens. They hadn't won the war, just one battle in a much larger, ongoing struggle. He stood amidst the wreckage, the stolen weapons still clenched tightly in his hand. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was determination. The others stood around him, battered and bruised, but alive and ready. They had defied the odds, but they all knew this was only the beginning. There wasn't much time to rest. The aliens wouldn't stay disorganized for long. Soon, reinforcements would come. They had no illusions about the scale of what they were up against. The aliens had entire armies, while the humans had little more than stolen weapons and whatever they could scavenge from the facility. But now, they had something more: momentum. They had proven to themselves that they could fight back. They could win. They quickly scavenged the alien weapons, tools, and anything they could use for the next stage of their fight. The command center's controls allowed them to see the facility's layout, giving them valuable insight into the aliens' operations. There were more prisoners, more humans held in other parts of the complex, and freeing them was their next priority. They couldn't take on the aliens alone, but together they stood a chance. He organized the group quickly. There wasn't time for hesitation. They moved through the facility like shadows, striking at small pockets of alien guards still patrolling the halls. Each encounter was swift, brutal, and efficient. The guards weren't prepared for this level of resistance. The prisoners had become something more, something unstoppable. It didn't take long to reach the other holding areas. The sight of more prisoners, chained and broken like they had once been, reignited their fury. The guards barely had time to react before they were overwhelmed. The chains were cut, and the prisoners were freed. Confusion mixed with hope as the newly freed humans realized what had happened. It didn't take much convincing to rally them to the cause. They had all been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to lead the charge. The numbers swelled quickly, and with each freed prisoner, the rebellion grew stronger. The aliens were losing control, and it showed. Panic spread among the remaining guards, their once rigid discipline giving way to disarray. The humans pressed their advantage, moving quickly through the remaining areas of the facility, taking down any resistance they encountered. It was a relentless push forward, driven by desperation and the desire for freedom. But as they reached the final section of the facility, the alien overlords unleashed their final line of defense. Reinforcements had arrived, elite alien soldiers, heavily armed and ready for battle. They stormed into the facility, their weapons blazing. The humans, though outnumbered and outgunned, didn't back down. There was no room for fear, no time to retreat. The battle was fierce, the kind that could end everything in a matter of moments. Energy blasts lit up the halls, and the sound of weapons clashing filled the air. He fought alongside his people, every swing, every shot driven by pure survival. The elite aliens were stronger, faster, and far more prepared than the guards they had faced before, but that didn't stop the humans. What they lacked in strength, they made up for in sheer will. The tide of the battle seemed to sway back and forth, each side pushing harder and harder. But just when it seemed like the aliens might overwhelm them, something shifted. The humans, despite their exhaustion, pushed back with a fury that stunned the elite soldiers. This wasn't just a battle for control of the facility anymore. This was a fight for their very survival, and the humans had no intention of losing. With one final surge, they broke through the alien defenses. The last of the elite soldiers fell, their weapons clattering to the ground. The humans stood victorious, though many had fallen in the fight. The survivors were battered, their faces streaked with blood and grime, but they were standing. They had won. He stood at the center of it all, breathing heavily, his mind racing. The facility was theirs, completely and undeniably. But the cost had been high. Many had died in the process, and even more were wounded. The rebellion had succeeded in taking the facility, but the battle had only just begun. The rest of the planet was still under alien control, and there were more prisoners out there waiting to be freed. As the dust settled, he looked out at the group of survivors. There was no celebration, no cheering. They were too tired for that, and they knew better than to think the fight was over. But there was a quiet understanding, a shared determination. They had done what no one thought was possible. They had taken down the aliens in their own territory. That was enough for now. They gathered what they could from the facility: supplies, weapons, anything that might help in the battles to come. They couldn't stay here for long. Soon, the aliens would send more forces, and they needed to be ready. But before they left, he made sure one thing was clear to everyone. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about fighting back. About taking back what was theirs. They had been captives, victims of the alien overlords' cruelty. But not anymore. Now they were free. And they would keep fighting until all of humanity was free, or they died trying. With that final thought in mind, they left the facility, moving into the unknown, ready for whatever came next. The fight for freedom had just begun. But now they had hope. And that was something the aliens had never counted on.